What if the greatest secret ever written wasn't written by a man at all? Long before Egypt, before recorded history, a being claimed to possess the knowledge of the gods. He called himself Thoth, scribe of Atlantis, master of time, and keeper of forbidden truths. This is not myth. This is episode 1 of the forbidden teachings of the Emerald Tablets, and everything you know is about to be rewritten. Thoth's name echoes from stone temples in Egypt to cryptic scrolls in Alexandria, yet his true origin predates even the pyramids. In the ancient language of Zep-Tepi, the first time, he was known as Djehuty, a celestial being not born of woman, but manifested, complete, aware, and ancient before the earth had finished cooling. In the Emerald Tablets, he makes a startling claim that he was not merely a chronicler of human history, but its architect, a being who descended not from a throne, but from the stars. Not a god in robes, but a technician of the soul, an engineer of spirit and form. If you want to read the source for yourself, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean is linked in the description. This isn't light reading. It's a codebook for the soul. The tablets depict Atlantis not as fantasy, but as a real and tangible civilization, unlike any we've ever known, one where the boundaries between mind, matter, and energy didn't exist, where thought could be programmed like software and language operated like physics. Pyramids weren't tombs, they were tools. Frequency and intention weren't spiritual concepts, they were power sources. Thoth tells of floating citadels, glowing ley lines, and resonant chambers that healed the body with sound. Atlantis was a world where the spiritual and scientific were the same. But like all golden ages, it had its shadow. And when that shadow grew too large, the balance broke. The fall of Atlantis wasn't an explosion. It was an unraveling. Pride replaced wisdom. The keepers of knowledge began to isolate it. Greed calcified into governance. And in one final breach of cosmic law, a technology was awakened that should never have been touched. The Earth responded, and the frequency that once empowered Atlantis now fractured it. Only one man, or one being, saw it coming and was prepared. Thoth didn't flee in panic. He evacuated knowledge. He entered what he called the Ship of the Master, a vehicle not made of metal, but woven from light, geometry, and harmonic codes. It didn't cut through air. It slipped between dimensions. And with it, he traveled to a land then called Khem. There, amid sand and silence, Thoth didn't seek to rebuild Atlantis. He sought to encode it. He mapped the stars onto stone. He taught the sacred math. He gave birth to mystery schools. And, most importantly, he sealed away the Emerald Tablets in what we now call the Hall of Records, a chamber that legends placed directly beneath the Sphinx. Could such a chamber really exist? In the 1990s, seismic scans beneath the Sphinx revealed unexplained cavities, right where Thoth said the tablets were hidden. Egyptologists dismissed them, but explorers like John Anthony West and Robert Schoch argued the evidence was too precise to ignore. So what's written on these tablets? Not commandments, not prophecy, but instructions. Instructions for soul navigation, for memory activation, for time manipulation. Thoth describes passing through the halls of Amenti, a realm between death and rebirth, where great beings rest in suspended animation, their minds reaching across time. He speaks of transferring consciousness like moving data from one vessel to another. Imagine reincarnation, but directed, chosen, and fully aware. What if death was just an exit program, and you could reboot with everything you've ever learned intact? This is the world Thoth lived in, a world where knowledge was power, but more importantly, power was a test. And like any test, it wasn't meant for everyone. Thoth embedded layers into his teachings, symbols, harmonics, geometry, so that only the disciplined, the initiated, the humble could access the full meaning. Because information without preparation is dangerous. And here's where things get strange. Thoth wasn't the only one to write of such ideas. Across time and culture, echoes appear. In Sumer, Enki holds the tablets of destiny. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl descends from the stars, bearing knowledge. Even in the Book of Enoch, watchers fall from heaven, bringing forbidden wisdom. Are these all fragments of the same being? And if so, what was he preparing us for? As the noise of modern life grows louder, something deeper stirs. Thoth's words, once buried in esoteric circles, are emerging again, and not by accident. Because when a civilization teeters on the edge, when science outpaces soul, voices like his return, not to save us, but to remind us that we were once more than we are, and we can be again. Atlantis, just say the word, and your mind conjures domes of crystal, flying machines, and sunken marble cities. But Thoth's Atlantis was something else entirely. He didn't describe a utopia of technology. He described a civilization of consciousness, a culture so attuned to the fabric of reality they could shape it, not with machines, but with mind. But how do you govern a society that knows how to bend time? Thoth wrote that Atlantis was ruled not by kings, but by the children of the light, 9 sovereign beings who acted more like harmonic stabilizers than leaders. Their job wasn't to control the people. It was to maintain resonance. These weren't just spiritual figures. They were frequency engineers, masters of what we now might call unified field dynamics. Imagine cities powered by crystals, tuned to the Earth's own ley lines. Structures built not for shelter, but for resonance, healing, and multidimensional access. Roads embedded with sacred geometry, guiding your very thoughts as you walked. And in the center of it all, the temple of the one light. This temple wasn't just sacred ground. It was an interface, a gate between dimensions. And only Thoth, as high priest, could enter its inner sanctum without distortion, because to stand in the heart of that chamber, your vibration had to match the code. Atlantis didn't believe in science and spirit. They knew no difference between them. For a more grounded and equally mysterious account, check out The Lost Teachings of Atlantis by John Peniel. It's a lesser-known gem, but dense with parallels to Thoth's version. The link's in the description, but here's where it begins to fracture. As generations passed, the purity of Atlantis dimmed. The lower castes, those less disciplined in mental mastery, began to hunger for power. Not understanding the sacred nature of energy, they sought to weaponize it, to bind elemental forces into technology. And slowly, the children of the light lost their grip. The tablets speak of a faction Thoth calls the Sons of Belial, a rebellious sect who broke from the spiritual order. They saw power not as a force to harmonize with, but to control. These were not cartoon villains. They were brilliant, charismatic. They promised progress, safety, control, and the people listened. Rhetorical interrupt. When given the choice between freedom and control, how often do we choose chains that shine? As Atlantis split in ideology, so too did its resonance. Temples built to stabilize the Earth's grid were hijacked and reversed. Devices originally used for healing were twisted into frequency disruptors. The sky grew unstable. The land began to quake, not because of war, but because of dissonance. And through it all, Thoth warned them. He documented the shifts in harmony. He pleaded with the children of the light to withdraw energy from the corrupted sectors. But the balance was already broken. The cosmic pendulum had begun to swing. And Atlantis, this brilliant, resonant jewel, was now a tuning fork for destruction. He knew it couldn't be saved, but its knowledge could be. This was the moment Thoth began recording the Emerald Tablets. He wasn't writing history. He was writing a backup drive for human potential. Every chant, symbol, geometric code, it was all a compression of consciousness. And as Atlantis spiraled, he began constructing the light vessel that would carry him and his message into the next world. But not everyone was allowed to come. The children of the light, in their final act, sealed themselves in what Thoth called the halls of Amenti, a place beneath the earth, in stasis, waiting for the vibration of humanity to rise again. They didn't die. They parked, locked in crystalline chambers, sleeping between dimensions, waiting to be reactivated. This wasn't science fiction. Thoth described it as spiritual engineering, and he made a promise that when the time was right, they would return. But here's the deeper implication. What if the fall of Atlantis wasn't a mistake? What if it was a choice, a cosmic reset, a strategic forgetting? Because humanity had reached a ceiling, and the only way to evolve further was to lose everything and start again. We often imagine Atlantis as a tragedy, but through Thoth's eyes, it was a lesson, a warning encoded in myth, a sacred memory buried not to be lost, but to be earned back. And you, if you're hearing this now, you're already in the process of remembering. Atlantis was gone, not slowly, not politically, but like a snapped harp string. One moment, harmonic brilliance, the next, silence. And Thoth, one of its last conscious architects, stood amid the ruins, not in mourning, but in motion, with the light vessel he had engineered, more meditation chamber than aircraft. He traversed space, not with speed, but with vibration. Through corridors of resonance, he exited the collapsing world and entered another, a raw, untamed land called Khem. Today, we call it Egypt, but back then, it was nothing like the dynastic empires we read about. No pharaohs, no hieroglyphs, just nomadic tribes, stargazers and sky worshippers, people who felt the call of the cosmos, but had no words for it. That's where Thoth began again. But this time, he didn't descend as a traveler. He descended as a god. You see, to the people of Khem, Thoth wasn't just foreign. He was impossible. A being clothed in light, speaking in symbols, creating form with gesture alone. He knew their names before they told him. He showed them constellations before they had numbers. He walked through fire. He called down thunder. And with each display, he wasn't proving divinity. He was establishing authority, not to control, but to teach. This is how myth begins, not in fiction, but in misunderstood fact. If you want to glimpse this moment of transmission, the Kybalion, written thousands of years later by initiates still echoing Thoth's teachings, is in the description. Read between the lines, and you'll feel the pulse of Atlantis. In Khem, Thoth chose 12 disciples. Not kings, not warriors, but initiates, those who could quiet the ego long enough to hear something deeper. He taught them not how to read and write, but how to remember. He mapped the energy centers of the body. He taught healing through harmonic tones. He spoke of the inner sun that never sets, what modern traditions might call the soul. And then he built pyramids, obelisks, temples, but not as tombs, as tools. Each was aligned with astronomical precision, not to glorify the dead, but to mirror the heavens. Because Thoth knew, as above, so below. To raise a civilization, you don't need armies. You need resonance. This is the origin of the Egyptian mystery schools. Not cults, not secret societies, but training grounds for those ready to move from sleep to wakefulness, to step out of time and remember what it means to be eternal. And beneath all of it, deep below the desert, he hid something else. The Hall of Records. Skeptics call it myth. But seismic scans around the Great Sphinx have revealed voids, chambers, and anomalies that defy mainstream explanation. Edgar Cayce predicted its discovery. Zahi Hawass denies it. But the blueprints? They're in the tablets. Thoth said he stored everything there. Atlantean history, soul maps, star alignments, the formula for interdimensional travel. And most critically, the emerald tablets themselves. Indestructible, immutable, impervious to time. Written in a cipher so advanced, it can't be read. It must be decoded by vibration. Meaning unless your consciousness is tuned to the correct frequency, it's just green stone. But when that key is found, The language unlocks not just information, but transformation. Thoth didn't want followers. He wanted mirrors, beings who would reflect his light and amplify it. Not worshippers, but successors. And so, he vanished. No death, no burial, just stories of a god who came, taught, and disappeared, only to be replaced by statues, titles, and eventually, dogma. That's the tragedy, but it's also the test. What happens when truth is encoded so well? Even its seekers mistake the map for the treasure. For generations, Thoth's students kept the teachings alive, through symbol, chant, and initiation. But over time, as power changed hands, even they forgot the source. The rituals became routine, the knowledge fragmented, but the tablets waited, waiting for a world that had lost itself. A world so noisy it couldn't hear, so distracted it couldn't remember. That world is ours. And you're here, listening, not by chance, but by resonance. Because maybe, just maybe, you've been here before. Egypt holds more secrets underground than it does above. For centuries, explorers have combed its deserts for treasure. But what they've missed is the signal, the resonance that pulses below the sand. Not gold, but geometry. Not tombs, but technologies. Thoth didn't come to Khem to build monuments. He came to bury a legacy, not to hide it, but to protect it. According to the emerald tablets, beneath the paws of the great Sphinx lies a vast chamber, untouched, undiscovered, and deliberately concealed. The Hall of Records, a vault designed not for the dead, but for the awakened. This isn't romantic fantasy. In 1993, seismic surveys conducted by Dr. Thomas Dobecki and John Anthony West revealed cavities under the Sphinx, perfectly rectangular voids, not caused by nature, but by design. The Egyptian authorities dismissed it. The mainstream academic community buried the data. But the tablets spoke of this thousands of years ago, and Thoth said this chamber held more than scrolls. It held a device, a beacon, a kind of spiritual battery designed to realign Earth with the cosmos at a precise astronomical moment. Think of it like a tuning fork, meant to resonate once, then reset the grid of consciousness. And guess what? That moment may be near. One of the most vivid interpretations of this cosmic legacy can be found in The Lost Teachings of Atlantis by John Peniel. It explores how ancient brotherhoods were formed, not to preserve politics, but to guard frequency. The link is in the description. But back to the chamber. Thoth describes how the emerald tablets themselves were placed inside, protected by mechanisms that no thief or uninitiated seeker could bypass. Not booby traps, but resonance locks, triggers that respond not to hands, but to minds. Only one attuned to truth, not fear, not ego, could enter without consequence. This is why so many expeditions fail, because you can't force your way into a temple built for consciousness. But let's be clear, these aren't just poetic metaphors. Thoth details a real structure: limestone corridors, quartz-lined walls, and a central crystalline altar shaped like a cube inside a sphere. A place designed not just to store data, but to amplify awareness. The closer you get, the more it awakens your deepest memories. Memories not from this life, but from before. And if you're thinking, why haven't we found this yet? Ask yourself, what kind of civilization builds a superstructure meant to be invisible to the unworthy? Thoth didn't want it lost. He wanted it found when the time was right. Rhetorical interrupt. If a secret is buried for 12,000 years, is it still a secret or a test? That time, he claimed, would come when humanity stood again at the edge, armed with nuclear power, blind to spirit, fragmented and forgetful. Sound familiar? In Thoth's words, when darkness covers the earth like a shroud, and man forgets his own name, the light will rise from beneath the sands. But the Hall of Records wasn't built alone. It was part of a network, nodes of consciousness connected across the planet. Machu Picchu, Angkor Wat, Stonehenge, and yes, Giza, a global system built in synchrony using sound, magnetism, and cosmic alignment to encode a message across millennia. That message? Remember who you are. And yet, despite all this grandeur, Thoth never claims ownership. He always refers to himself as a son of Atlantis, a servant of the Law of One. He was not a god. He was a reminder, a wake-up call cast in emerald and stone. So why isn't this common knowledge? Because we stopped listening. Over time, the priesthoods took the symbols and turned them into status. The mystery schools became exclusive clubs. The teachings that were once alive were turned into rituals, repeated, not understood. And the hall was forgotten, or perhaps protected. Thoth wrote, "When the sleeping ones begin to stir, when their dreams grow louder than the world, then the doors shall open." That's not prophecy. That's a design protocol. It means these teachings activate in response to you, not when you're perfect, not when you're ready, but when you're searching. Because awakening doesn't begin with knowing. It begins with asking. So what are the tablets really waiting for? A code? A chosen one? Or maybe they're waiting for a critical mass, for enough minds to reawaken, for enough souls to listen. Because when consciousness hits resonance, when humanity remembers just enough, the vault doesn't just open, it sings. And if you're still watching, still listening, you've already started. Thoth never feared death. He studied it, catalogued it, mastered it. In his words, death was never the end. It was simply a corridor, a shift in frequency, a doorway not to nothingness, but to memory. The emerald tablets speak of a realm called the Halls of Amenti, a liminal space beneath the earth where beings of great light sleep, waiting for the call to rise again. But here's the part that most people miss. Thoth claimed he didn't just know the halls. He used them. He wrote that he entered these chambers to rejuvenate his body, to live across lifetimes, not by reincarnation, but by choice. Conscious transference of identity, a type of biological rebirth that bypassed the veil of forgetting. Not soul migration, but identity retention. This wasn't metaphysics. This was engineering, a kind of spiritual technology that let him transfer from one body to another, intact, whole, unchanged. Imagine saving a consciousness file and uploading it into new hardware. This is what Thoth described, and he said it was natural law, not reserved for gods but available to any who remembered how. He said, "I dwell in the body, but I'm not of it. I change forms like the stars change positions, but the light within remains the same." What kind of knowledge makes a man immune to death? The text, The Lost Teachings of Atlantis by John Peniel, explores this idea further, suggesting ancient schools trained initiates to retain soul awareness through death and beyond. Thoth tells of stasis chambers in the halls of Amenti, rooms designed not to preserve flesh, but to reset frequency. Think of it like tuning an instrument. When a soul's resonance drops too low, these chambers restore it. Each resting place was guarded by a flame of life, described not as fire, but as sentient light. Light that judged, not to punish, but to mirror back truth. Those who entered in alignment with cosmic law, they emerged renewed. Those who didn't, they simply did not return. This raises a bigger question. If death is optional, what else have we misunderstood? Modern science studies aging like a disease. We count cells, catalog telomeres, and call it biology. But Thoth said aging was not decay. It was dissonance, a loss of alignment with source. The body fades because the mind forgets. The more fragmented the self becomes, the faster the clock turns. But what if the key to immortality isn't in labs, but in memory? The Emerald Tablets insist that remembrance, not of childhood, but of origin, is what reactivates the template of eternal life. Thoth describes how each soul carries an original pattern, a divine architecture. When aligned with this seed of light, the body regenerates. Time bends, identity anchors, and the method? It wasn't medication, it was vibration. Chants, symbols, light codes, all designed to bring the body's frequencies into harmony with what he called the law of one. This wasn't dogma, it was physics. What we call chakras, he called wheels of flame. What we call sound healing, he called command tones. Thoth said every part of the body is musical, and when in tune, it doesn't age. It resonates. And that resonance allows the body to become a container for something far beyond just life. It becomes a conduit. So if you could step into a chamber and walk out timeless, and would you? Thoth made it clear. Immortality isn't about escaping death. It's about remembering your identity beyond it. Those who chased eternal life for power, he said, were always the first to fall. Because without alignment, longevity becomes a curse. You carry your fragmentation with you, forever. But when you anchor to truth, you don't just extend life, you amplify it. This is why the teachings were hidden, not because they were forbidden, but because they were dangerous to those who would use them to dominate instead of liberate. He encoded these lessons in the tablets, not to be read casually, but to be decoded. Each line is layered with geometry, numerology, and resonance. They're not chapters, they're circuits, and only when read with the right inner frequency do they unlock their meaning. One verse reads, "Man is a flame bound to the earth by desire, but when desire is purified, he ascends, and the flame becomes the sun." That's not poetry. That's a transformation protocol. To live forever, you must burn clean. And if you think this is all ancient fantasy, remember, modern science is catching up. Today, quantum biology confirms that the body reacts to vibrational input. Mitochondria can be influenced by sound. Brain waves sync to frequencies. DNA responds to intention. What Thoth knew millennia ago, our best labs are just beginning to confirm. So maybe immortality isn't about defeating time. Maybe it's about aligning with something outside of it. And according to Thoth, that something is already inside you. Egypt wasn't just a refuge, it was a restart. When Thoth arrived in Khem, what we now call Egypt, he wasn't fleeing, he was planting. According to the Emerald Tablets, Thoth didn't simply seek sanctuary after Atlantis fell. He sought continuity. His mission was to preserve the Atlantean blueprint, not in scrolls, but in stone. He constructed what he called a temple of light, a structure calibrated to the frequencies of Earth's axis, the stars, and the human body. This wasn't architecture, it was encoding. And the workers? They weren't slaves, they were initiates. Each block, angle, and corridor was layered with intention. The temples weren't just symbolic, they were interactive. They used sound, light, and geometry to influence consciousness. Thoth described the temple as a mirror, a place where what you believed would become what you saw. But perhaps the most startling claim? He said these temples were alive. A companion text, the Kybalion by the three initiates, outlines Hermetic principles that echo these ideas. Vibration, polarity, correspondence, laws that bridge the gap between physics and mysticism. You'll find that link in the description. Thoth claimed that the Great Pyramid of Giza, built by his design, was a resonance generator. Its true purpose wasn't burial, it was transformation. Deep inside the pyramid was a chamber where frequency and consciousness merged. Those who entered as men could leave as something more. He wrote, "Raise thou thine frequency, traveler of the stars. Let the pyramid be thy gate to the infinite." Let that sink in. A gateway. Not metaphor, literal, rhetorical. Interrupt. What if Giza wasn't built to honor the dead, but to awaken the living? Modern engineers still puzzle over the pyramid's precision. Its base aligns almost perfectly to true north. Its internal temperature remains constant. Its dimensions encode pi, phi, and the speed of light. But Thoth said those measurements weren't accidents. They were keys, frequencies in stone. He wasn't just building for Egypt. He was building for us. Because every detail, every resonance was meant to survive cycles. Thoth knew time wasn't linear. It looped. And in the tablets, he warned of coming darkness, of civilizations rising and falling like tides. But he also said, "When the stars return to their rightful positions, the temple shall speak again." Is that time? Now, the layout of Giza mirrors Orion's belt. The shafts in the king's chamber align to Sirius, Orion, and Draco. These were Thoth's star maps, celestial GPS encoded into architecture. Why? Because the temples weren't just meant to guide seekers on Earth, but from the stars. According to ancient lore, Thoth came from a star system in Orion, possibly linked to the beings Egyptians called the Neteru. He wasn't preserving the past. He was triangulating a future reunion. And beneath all of this, beneath the sand, beneath the Sphinx, he said he hid the Hall of Records, a chamber filled with Atlantean knowledge, crystalline archives that hold the memory of Earth's true history. Edgar Cayce echoed this, saying the hall would be found in our time. In the 1990s, seismic surveys around the Sphinx revealed rectangular voids, precisely where Thoth said the hall would be. Egyptologists dismissed it, but the data remains. What if beneath the world's most iconic statue lies the reboot button for human history? Thoth didn't want power. He wanted us to remember. He said, "Man forgets that he is light. In forgetting, he falls into shadow. But in remembering, he rises." That's what the temples were for. Not worship, not sacrifice, reactivation, designed to shake the dust from ancient memory. They're not limited to Egypt. Thoth said he built 12 such temples across the globe, each connected by energetic lines, what we now call ley lines. When activated, these sites could create a planetary grid of resonance, designed to uplift human consciousness globally. Think of it like Earth's operating system. And Thoth? He wasn't the only architect. He wrote of the Seven, ascended beings from higher realms who helped encode the planet with memory nodes. Some know them as archangels, others as the Elohim. To Thoth, they were the masters of light. Their mission, to prepare Earth for awakening. But the keys were never meant for the masses, not at first. He wrote, "Only the seeker, purified by truth, may activate the stone. Only the humble shall hear the code." Which raises the question, what if the myths, temples, and glyphs were never meant to tell us anything? What if they were waiting for us to remember? Thoth never called himself a priest. He called himself an initiate. And that distinction changes everything. To be an initiate wasn't about titles, temples, or rituals for show. It was about alchemical transformation. The Emerald Tablets make this clear. The path isn't external, it's internal. To activate the codes, to walk the halls, to even understand what Thoth left behind, you first have to master yourself. Not by reading, but by burning. He described a fire, not physical, but energetic, that sleeps in every human. A fire that can rise through the body, lighting up memory, purpose, and power. In other cultures, they call it Kundalini. But Thoth called it the Serpent of Light. What if the gods didn't demand worship, but activation? According to the tablets, Atlantean initiates were trained to raise this fire deliberately, not through chance, through precision. Breath, intention, geometry, sound, used in sequence to awaken the divine within. It wasn't magic, it was technique. The Lost Teachings of Atlantis by John Peniel explores these forgotten methods. It's dense, it's raw, but it mirrors Thoth's roadmap. The link's in the description. Thoth claimed that when this inner fire reaches the brain, it ignites something dormant, something ancient. He called it the crystal of consciousness. a faculty that allows one to see beyond time, beyond space, to remember before birth and after death. Sound familiar? Modern science calls it the pineal gland. Ancient texts call it the third eye. Thoth said it was a seed from a prior age. If activated fully, it could allow the initiate to bypass death, not by avoiding it, but by navigating it consciously. Thoth described the process as becoming twice born. The first birth is physical. The second? That's when you remember who you are without the body. He wrote, "Die and be reborn, O man. Rise from the ashes. Know yourself as flame." In the initiation process, this death wasn't metaphor. It was induced. Through fasting, sound chambers, isolation, and breathwork, initiates entered near-death states on purpose so they could train for what came next. They called it the trial of the dark. And the chambers for this? They still exist. Beneath the temples of Egypt, especially at Dendera, Luxor, and Edfu, lie underground passages carved to distort perception. Light disappears, sound warps. These weren't architectural anomalies. They were sensory reset zones, designed to trigger disassociation from the material world. Only once the initiate passed through these shadows could they ascend to the upper halls to receive the higher teachings. Because Thoth knew that ego cannot hold light, it must first be stripped. And what was the final lesson? That the body isn't real. Thoth taught that physical form is just compressed vibration, temporary, illusory. The initiate's task was to experience identity without form, so they'd never again be fooled by illusion. It was the ultimate red pill, long before the metaphor existed. And once the trial was complete, Thoth said the initiate could access what he called the light body, a vehicle of pure frequency, built from consciousness and memory, not matter. With it, the initiate could travel between worlds, not in a ship, but in self. What if the real Stargate was inside you? This wasn't just spiritual language, it was literal. The Emerald tablets speak of passages through the stars and gates of fire that open to the worthy. Ancient Egyptian depictions of the Ba and Ka souls rising through star maps align with this. We see the same symbolism across Tibet, Mesoamerica, and India, because the teachings weren't regional. They were Atlantean, and the initiates who passed the trial, they became builders of the flame, teachers, guides, and protectors of the memory. Thoth didn't just leave this system behind. He hid it, fragmented in myths, scattered in symbols, not to control access, but because he understood. Only those willing to walk through darkness should wield light. His words, "The truth, when undeserved, becomes destruction." So the real question isn't, is it true? It's, are you ready? Because once this fire is lit, it can't be undone. What if words weren't just sounds? What if they were codes? Thoth claimed that language wasn't invented, it was inherited, passed down from the architects of reality, encoded with vibration, geometry, and force. In the Emerald tablets, he didn't describe speech as a tool. He called it a technology, a way to manipulate energy, access hidden memory, and even bend the fabric of time itself. This isn't poetic metaphor. It's operational. Every letter, every syllable, every symbol, according to Thoth, carries a unique frequency. Combine them the right way, and you don't just describe the world, you reshape it. In ancient Khem, the original Egyptian mystery schools taught that hieroglyphs weren't just pictures, they were power diagrams. Each symbol was an intersection of cosmic law and terrestrial function. The Eye of Horus, for instance, wasn't just an eye. It was a mathematical key. It encoded the golden ratio, auditory resonance, and brain activation in one glyph. What if every ancient symbol was a switch, and you're the circuit? Thoth took it further. He described something called the sound of the source, a primordial vibration that underlies all creation. In Hindu cosmology, this would be Om. In physics, we'd call it the zero-point field. But to Thoth, it was a template tone, and all sacred language was just an echo of it. He claimed that certain chants, intoned at precise frequencies, could unlock dormant strands of DNA. That language itself could activate memory, align consciousness, and open interdimensional gates. In the tablets, he speaks of the word that opens the flame, a vibrational phrase only the fully initiated could use. The Kybalion, written thousands of years later, echoes these principles. It decodes Hermetic laws that trace back to Thoth, especially the law of vibration. Links in the description if you're ready to explore how frequency defines form. But what does this mean for us right now? It means our words matter more than we know. Every sentence we speak programs the field around us. Every thought we translate into language creates reality. When Thoth said, "As above, so below," he didn't mean heaven mirrors earth. He meant thought becomes flesh by way of the word. That's why the initiates were trained in silence first. Before they could speak the ancient names, they had to purge distortion. Ego, fear, lies, self-deception, all of it. Because if language is power, and power corrupts, then purity becomes a requirement. And what of the tablets themselves? Thoth wrote them in what he called the language of the flame, a script that can't be spoken by those uninitiated. He said the glyphs weren't inked, but vibrated into the emerald itself. And they still vibrate. Some say they hum when held. Others claim dreams change after simply seeing an image. But no copies exist in museums. No governments claim to have them. So where are they? The tablets, according to Thoth, were sealed in a vault beneath the Sphinx, what he called the lion that guards time. And here's the thing. Modern ground-penetrating radar has revealed a void beneath the Sphinx's right paw, a chamber never opened, never explored. Why? Because secrets that shape reality don't sit in gift shops. What if the greatest library on Earth is still buried? Some believe fragments of the tablets were smuggled out, decoded, and quietly disseminated. Others think the true texts were never physical at all, but encoded in the geometry of ancient structures. The pyramids, the ziggurats, even the temples of Angkor Wat, designed as sound chambers, not tombs, not homes, but tuning forks for human memory. And that brings us to the most important point. Thoth didn't just leave words for us to read. He left frequencies for us to awaken. Because when you speak words aligned with truth, intention, and clarity, your voice becomes a beacon, a transmitter. You become a scribe, not of history, but of possibility. Language, he said, is the most sacred act of creation. Not what you speak, but how you speak. From where, with what frequency of heart. That's the real magic. The tablets were never just texts. They were keys. And the voice? The lockpick. What destroys a civilization isn't always an enemy. Sometimes it's forgetting why the power was ever given. According to Thoth, Atlantis didn't fall from weakness. It fell from strength, unrestrained, unbalanced, unearned. They mastered nature. They channeled energy through stone. They commanded air, water, and fire. But they forgot the one element that binds all others: ethics. He warned that the Atlanteans began as servants of divine law, aligned with the source. But over time, knowledge became ownership. Power became identity. The initiate path became a marketplace. What was once sacred became strategized. And the moment wisdom was hoarded for personal gain, the whole system inverted. What good is light if it burns everything it touches? Thoth wrote of the Shadow Order, a group of high initiates who diverged from the original path. They began experimenting with dimensional energies, opening gates, crafting hybrid life, and manipulating timelines. These weren't mad scientists. They were priests, architects of the soul who lost themselves to curiosity without constraint. He called them the sons of Belial, those who worshipped separation, not as a philosophy, but as a weapon. They believed domination was divine. That power was the proof of alignment. The result? Collapse. Thoth describes it not as a war, but a disintegration. The harmonic resonance of the land began to fall apart. Cities fractured dimensionally. Entire regions vanished, not underwater, but into disconnected timelines. Atlantis didn't sink. It was sealed. So what did Thoth do? He encoded the failure into the tablets, but not as a warning, as a test. He said the true student must decipher the meaning behind the words, that only those who walk the path of internal integrity could unlock the teachings. In other words, the tablets are encrypted by consciousness. You can only understand them to the degree that your soul is ready to embody the wisdom. The Lost Teachings of Atlantis by John Peniel explores how spiritual corruption led to collapse. The link's in the description. Don't read it casually, read it when you're ready. What made Thoth different wasn't just his knowledge, it was his discipline. He never claimed divinity, he claimed memory, and he warned that knowledge without ethics leads not just to destruction, but to repetition. Because here's the twist. Thoth wasn't writing to warn the past, he was writing to warn the future. United States. He saw the cycles repeating, technology rising faster than wisdom, systems prioritizing control over consciousness, and he encoded the same patterns of fall into his teachings. And you don't need emerald stones to see it, just look around. Are we Atlantis all over again? But there's another layer here, one we haven't touched yet. Thoth believed ethics were energetic, that the purity of your intent had a measurable frequency, that actions carried resonance, and that when a society slips below a certain vibrational threshold, it self-erases, not from punishment, but non-alignment with universal harmony. So he didn't preach morality. He taught frequency. He designed rituals to recalibrate the human field, mantras to return the mind to stillness, symbols to anchor the heart to truth. He created temples that weren't meant to impress, but to transform, places where the sound of your own breath could realign your soul, where light bent in sacred geometries to remind you who you are. Because to Thoth, remembering was the real repentance, not guilt, not shame, but frequency. He taught that ethical action isn't about avoiding punishment, it's about resonance. If you act from fear, you generate chaos. If you act from truth, you harmonize. And when enough individuals harmonize, empires change, not through war, but through coherence. This is what Atlantis forgot. This is what Thoth remembered, and this is why the tablets still hum. They're not inert history, they're alive, and they're waiting for a species wise enough to hear them without weaponizing them. In many ways, that's the final test. Not whether we decode the symbols, but whether we deserve them. Thoth never recruited followers. He cultivated initiates. And initiation wasn't about robes, rituals, or sacred titles. It was a psycho-spiritual death, a dismantling of the ego, a purification of intent, and a reactivation of dormant faculties most of us forgot we had. In the Emerald Tablets, Thoth outlines a path, not linear, not hierarchical, but spiral, each rotation deeper into self, each turn dissolving another illusion. To walk it meant to become less person and more pattern, less mind and more memory. But what did it take to begin? Silence. Not the absence of sound, but the cessation of internal noise. In modern times, silence feels like suffocation. But to Thoth, silence was the first door. Only when the chaos of thought quiets does the ancient memory rise. Thoth wrote that the mind, in its untrained state, is like a chattering storm. Memory can't land in chaos. Truth can't echo in distortion. So the first rite wasn't outward, it was inward. The initiate was taught to sit, to listen, and to dismantle the architecture of their false self. Could you sit in absolute stillness and face yourself with no distraction? The early Atlantean initiations weren't ceremonies, they were disintegrations. You weren't granted power, You were stripped down until what remained was compatible with power. You fasted, you wandered, you dreamed, you remembered. The tablets suggest that true initiation only begins when you're no longer asking for proof, because your being is the proof. Thoth never promised reward. He promised transformation. He said the journey would be terrifying, and it was meant to be, because real change doesn't feel like success. It feels like dying, and the ones who couldn't handle it, they never returned. He speaks of chambers built not with brick, but with frequency, where sound was used like surgery, cutting through identity, trauma, memory, until only truth remained. These were the temples beneath the temples, places where you didn't learn anything. You remembered what was encoded in your being before birth. The Kybalion, a distillation of Hermetic teachings believed to echo Thoth's voice, offers principles of vibration, polarity, and mentalism. The link's in the description. Read it not for facts, but for frequency. The path of the initiate wasn't something one completed, it was something one became. Because, as Thoth made clear, to hold true knowledge was not to speak it, but to embody it. You didn't teach wisdom, you were wisdom. Initiates were taught the 4 acts of self-initiation: observation, see the illusion without reacting to it; reflection, hold the shadow without merging with it; transmutation, convert distortion into clarity; alignment, return the inner cosmos to still orbit. This was spiritual engineering, not faith, and it had one requirement above all: radical honesty, because power is dangerous, and Thoth refused to hand over ancient frequencies to unexamined minds. Would you trust yourself with the keys to the universe? Initiation was also ancestral. Thoth taught that knowledge doesn't belong to you, it flows through you. That when you walk the initiate path, you are not just changing yourself, you're repairing the entire line: bloodline, mind line, soul line. He said the moment an initiate awakened, ripples moved through the collective field. That healing was non-linear. When one remembered, the many stirred. This is why he built his temples in geometries of resonance. To amplify consciousness, to harmonize the initiate with not just the earth, but the field of memory itself. Initiates weren't isolated mystics. They were anchors, beacons holding specific frequencies for the collective. They meditated not for escape, but for planetary recalibration. The initiate's path was never about escape. It was about return. Return to source, return to center, return to self. And the emerald tablets? They were the mirror, not to show you what you are, but to show you everything you've layered on top of it. To be clear, initiation was earned, not granted. You couldn't buy it. You couldn't fake it. You had to face the unfaceable, your own shadow, your own desire, your own forgotten promise. Because every initiate makes a vow, not out loud, but in soul frequency, to remember what the world taught you to forget. The initiate doesn't just study the tablets, they become them. And as Thoth whispered in the dark, to become the light, you must first survive the fire. If the emerald tablets were simply mystical poetry, they wouldn't have survived thousands of years. They were warnings. In every age, there comes a moment where a civilization stands at a threshold between evolution and extinction. Atlantis crossed it and fell. Thoth watched it happen, and he wrote the tablets so we might not do the same. His words aren't just esoteric riddles, they're a map. One encrypted in symbols, frequency, and metaphor, yes, but still a map. To what? To a functioning consciousness, to a being capable of wielding immense spiritual and technological power without destroying itself. Can a species evolve if it refuses to examine its own shadow? Thoth made it clear. The danger isn't knowledge. The danger is unintegrated knowledge. Truths accessed before the soul is ready to hold them. He witnessed Atlanteans unlocking vibrational forces capable of reshaping matter. They built crystalline grids, planetary stabilizers, and light crafts that folded dimensions. But when the ego took the throne, these tools became weapons. Sound familiar? The parallels with our time are too sharp to ignore. He wrote, "The dark shall rise in future ages, seeking to enslave men through their own desires." Not prophecy, pattern. History doesn't repeat. Consciousness does. And we're spiraling into a very familiar lesson. Thoth didn't just want us to read his warnings. He wanted us to embody them. That's why the tablets weren't written in everyday script. They were etched in sacred geometry, formed from vibration. Only the aligned could even perceive their message fully, not because it was hidden, but because the reader had to match the frequency. For a deeper dive into these principles, The Lost Teachings of Atlantis by John Peniel echoes many of Thoth's core warnings and practices. You'll find the link in the description. Thoth understood. Collapse doesn't come when darkness attacks from outside. Collapse comes when light stops guarding from within. He described dark priests, Atlanteans who fled with him to Egypt, but kept the corruption alive. They founded secret cults, twisted the teachings, turned spiritual law into systems of control. It's not fiction, it's architecture. We're still living in the shadows of those structures. And yet, Thoth didn't write from despair. His tone is solemn but hopeful. He believed humanity could transcend, could reawaken the ancient memory, could pass the test that Atlantis failed, but only if the initiate became the teacher, the knower became the guide, the student became the steward. That's why the tablets exist at all, not to scare, to prepare. What if the most advanced civilization on Earth left behind a recovery manual, and we're just now cracking it open? The final chapters of the tablets speak less of the past and more of what's to come. A time when men shall rise in anger and consume the earth. A time when the forgotten wisdom shall call to the few, and those few shall light the path for the many. A time when you are not just a spectator, but a participant, because once you've heard this story, once you've remembered the lost frequency, you can't unhear it. And once remembered, there's no going back, not to comfort, not to ignorance, not to sleep. The call is not external. It's not a prophecy. It's your own buried memory vibrating beneath the static of modern life. Thoth didn't fear collapse. He feared amnesia, the loss of memory, of origin, of light. That's why he encoded his voice in stone, so that when the world once again stood on the edge, someone, maybe you, would awaken. Thoth didn't end the emerald tablets with conclusions. He ended them with keys that don't unlock doors, but consciousness. Unlike most ancient texts that close with myth or decree, Thoth's final words strike a different chord. They are quiet, intentional, almost a whisper meant only for those who've listened deeply and are prepared to not just understand, but be changed. He doesn't say, "You are ready." He says, "Be ready," because the final truths aren't statements, they're vibrations, and they only respond to one thing: resonance. Throughout the tablets, Thoth draws attention to the flame within the soul. That flame becomes the test, not memory, not thought, but will. He writes, "He who overcomes self shall become immortal." It's not metaphor. It's not about heaven or reward. It's about shedding false identity, releasing attachment, and stepping into the part of yourself that was never born and can never die. What if the greatest lie ever told was that you were just this body, this name, this life? Thoth doesn't offer salvation. He offers sovereignty. His parting words are a command to remember, not just intellectually, but viscerally. He challenges the initiate to move in frequency, align with cosmic law, and live not for truth, but as truth. Because truth isn't something to learn, it's something to become. He speaks of seals, energetic gates that keep the unready from power they can't wield. These seals aren't physical locks. They're encoded in the soul, waiting to be opened by will, alignment, and selflessness. The final tablet isn't a conclusion. It's a cipher, and you're the codebreaker. If you're ready to unlock more, the Kybalion by the Three Initiates is a foundational key. It breaks down Hermetic law, the same principles Thoth embedded in every line. The link is in the description. Now, pause, not for drama, but for reflection. You've walked with a being who watched Atlantis fall, preserved its light, and still speaks. Not in temples, but in memory. These teachings aren't history, they're resonance. And now, they live in you. But this was just the beginning. Thoth made one final claim, one few dare repeat. The Emerald Tablets weren't the end. They were the threshold. He said something greater lies beneath the earth. A network, a chamber, the halls of Amenti, a place where time bends. Immortal guides sleep in stasis, and the blueprint of soul and species alike is protected not by locks, but by vibration. Not myth, infrastructure. And it's only part of a much larger war, because according to other ancient sources, Earth was never just a planet. It was a prize. And in the next chapter, we'll go deeper than the tablets. We'll explore the hidden galactic history behind Thoth's arrival, the cosmic struggle between the Arcturians and Lyrans, and how Earth became the battleground for a war over consciousness itself. Up next, Arcturians versus Lyrans, Galactic War for Earth's Blueprint. Click the link, because your soul might remember more than you think. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. Not for algorithms, for alignment, because this isn't just a series, it's a transmission, and the next signal is already pulsing.